The Arizona sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the red earth into a furnace that could cook a man alive. Thorne Brennick pulled his hat lower, squinting against the glare that made the horizon shimmer like water that wasn't there. 5 years today. 5 years since he'd buried Mariah in the plot behind the ranch house, her body consumed by fever, while he'd ridden 3 days to fetch a doctor who arrived too late. 5 years of waking alone. 5 years of silence so thick it pressed against his chest like a stone. He was 50 now, though his body hadn't surrendered to age the way some men's did. His hands were still steady, his eyes still sharp, but his heart, that was another matter. His heart had turned to leather, tough and dry, and useful for nothing but keeping him upright. The horse beneath him snorted, ears flicking forward. Thorne reined in, frowning. Something stood in the distance. Dark shapes against the brutal white sky. He counted 5 of them, vertical lines where nothing vertical should be. Not trees, nothing grew out here but scrub and spite. Not rock formations either. These were too regular, too purposeful. Posts, his jaw tightened. He'd seen this before years back. A warning, a display, the kind of thing men did when they wanted to send a message that would echo across the territory like thunder. He should turn back. Whatever this was, it wasn't his concern. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned it with Mariah's cold hand in his, learned it watching her slip away while he stood helpless as a child. The horse took 2 steps forward. Thorne didn't stop it. As he drew closer, the shapes resolved into clarity that made his stomach turn. 5 wooden posts, crude but solid, planted deep in the hardpan. And from each post, hanging upside down by ropes lashed around their ankles, were 5 young women, Apache. Their long black hair hung toward the earth like dark waterfalls frozen mid-pour. Blood had run from their wrists where the ropes had cut into flesh, dripping onto the sand below in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic, in a way that made Thorne's throat close. He dismounted before he decided to, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like a judgment. The sun had scorched their skin. Their dresses, simple cotton, torn in places, hung inverted, exposing their legs to the merciless heat. One of them, the smallest, hung completely still. No rise and fall of breath. No flutter of cloth, dead Thorne thought, or close enough that it made no difference. But then the oldest one moved. Her head lifted, an impossible feat given how the blood must have pooled in her skull, and her eyes found his. Dark eyes, nearly black, burning with something that transcended the physical agony she must be enduring. Her lips moved. No sound came out at first. Her throat was too parched, her tongue too swollen. But she tried again, forcing the words past cracked lips that had been baked by sun and wind. Please. The word fell into the desert silence like a stone into deep water. Thorne stood frozen. He'd seen terrible things in his 50 years. He'd seen men gut-shot and screaming. He'd seen women ravaged by disease. He'd watched his own wife waste away to nothing while he held her hand and lied about doctors coming, about medicine arriving, about hope. But he'd never seen this kind of desperation married to this kind of strength. Please, she said again, and this time her voice carried rough as gravel but clear. Save us, save my sisters. Thorne's hand went to his knife without thought. He was already moving toward the nearest post, the one holding the smallest girl, when the oldest one spoke again. I'll bear your children. He stopped. You can plant your seed in me every day, every night, whatever you want, however you want it. Her voice didn't shake, didn't plead. It was an offer stated as fact, a transaction proposed by someone who had nothing left to bargain with except her own body. Just save my sisters. Please, let them live. Thorne turned to look at her fully. Blood had darkened her face to a terrible purple black. Her eyes were bloodshot, the vessels burst from the pressure. But she held his gaze with a ferocity that reminded him of a wolf caught in a trap ready to gnaw off its own leg, if that's what survival demanded. This wasn't seduction. This wasn't even desperation in the way he understood it. This was a woman offering herself as a sacrifice so that others might live. Something cracked inside Thorne's chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 5 years suddenly fractured, and through the crack came a feeling he'd thought he'd buried with Mariah. The need to save someone. He didn't answer her, didn't acknowledge the offer. He simply walked to the smallest girl and began cutting the ropes. The knife was sharp, he kept it that way always, and the ropes were thick but not impossible. The first strand parted with a sound like a sigh, then the second. The girl's weight shifted as the bonds gave way, and Thorne caught her before she could fall headfirst into the sand. She weighed nothing, a bundle of bird bones wrapped in skin and cloth. He laid her down gently, his hand automatically going to her throat to check for a pulse. There. Faint, thready, but there. He moved to the second girl, then the third. His hands worked with mechanical efficiency, cutting and catching, lowering each one to the ground with a care that surprised him. He'd forgotten he could be gentle. The fourth girl gasped when he cut her down, sucking in air, like a drowning woman breaking the surface. Her hands clutched at his shirt, and he steadied her, murmuring something he didn't even hear himself say. Just sounds, just comfort. Then he came to the oldest one, the one who had spoken. She watched him approach with those burning eyes, and as his knife bit into the rope around her ankles, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, simple, direct. And somehow they carried more weight than her earlier offer. When the last rope parted, she fell into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him back. He braced himself, taking her weight, and for a moment they stood there, him upright, her suspended in his grip, their faces inches apart. This close he could see the damage. The burst blood vessels, the sun-cracked lips, the bruises where the ropes had dug into flesh. This close he could also see the strength, the set of her jaw, the refusal to close her eyes even though she must be exhausted beyond measure. "You're safe now," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "No one's dying here today." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the law and looking for the catch. She didn't find one. Something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not yet, but maybe the beginning of belief. He lowered her to the ground beside the others, then stepped back to survey what he'd done. 5 Apache women lay in the sand like broken dolls, their breathing shallow. Their skins scorched, their bodies trembling from trauma and exposure. They needed water, medicine, shelter. They needed more than he could give them here. Thorne looked at his horse, then at the women, then back at his horse. The ranch was 3 miles east. His horse could carry maybe 2 of them safely, which meant he'd be making multiple trips in heat that could kill a healthy man, let alone these half-dead girls. He should leave them, ride to town, get help, come back with a wagon and other men. But he knew what would happen if he left. The desert didn't wait. The sun didn't show mercy. In the time it took him to ride to town and back, at least one of them would die, maybe more. And he was so damn tired of watching people die. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and knelt beside the smallest girl, the one who'd been closest to death. He tipped water onto her lips, just a few drops, watching to make sure she could swallow. She did. Barely. He moved to the next one, then the next, giving each of them just enough water to keep them from slipping away, not so much that their bodies would revolt. The oldest one, the one who'd made the offer, watched him with those relentless eyes. When he reached her, she spoke again. "What's your name?" Her voice was stronger now. The water had helped. "Thorne," he said. "Thorne Brennick." "Naya," she said it like a challenge, like she was daring him to forget it. He wouldn't forget. He gave her water, watching her throat work as she swallowed. Then he stood and looked at the 5 of them, making calculations. Weight, distance, time. "I'm taking you to my ranch," he said. "It's going to take 3 trips. The small one and the next smallest first. Then the middle 2. Then you last." He met Naya's eyes. "You strong enough to wait?" Yes. No hesitation, no doubt. He believed her. The first trip took an hour, 40 minutes there, 20 back. He'd laid the 2 youngest across his saddle, walking alongside to steady them, talking to them even though neither one responded. Just the sound of a human voice. Just something to anchor them to the world of the living. At the ranch, he carried them inside to the room that had been Mariah's sewing room, the one he hadn't entered in 5 years. The bed was still made, the curtains still drawn. Dust covered everything like a shroud. He laid the girls on the bed, then went for water and cloth and the medical supplies he kept in the kitchen. Basic stuff, bandages, salve for burns, willow bark for pain. He worked quickly, wrapping the worst of their wounds, getting water into them in small sips, covering them with blankets even though the room was warm. Shock could kill as surely as the sun. Then he mounted his horse and rode back. The second trip was harder. The sun had climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The 2 middle girls were conscious enough to cling to him as the horse walked, their fingers digging into his arms with surprising strength. He talked to them too, told them about the ranch, about the creek that ran behind it fed by a spring that never ran dry, about the shade trees he'd planted years ago, when Mariah was still alive, when the future had seemed like something worth planning for. Neither girl responded, but their grips tightened when he spoke, so he kept talking. At the ranch, he settled them in the same room as their sisters, then stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the four of them. 4 lives he'd pulled back from the edge, 1 more to go. The third trip was the longest. By the time he reached the hanging field again, the sun was directly overhead, turning the sand into a mirror that threw heat like a weapon. Naya was still conscious, still upright, sitting in the sand with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could will him to arrive faster through sheer force of determination. When she heard the horse, she turned her head, and something in her expression made Thorne's chest tighten. Relief, pure and simple. She'd believed he would come back, but she'd also feared he wouldn't. He dismounted and walked to her, and this time he didn't ask permission. He simply scooped her up in his arms. She weighed more than her sisters, but still far too little, and carried her to the horse. She didn't protest, didn't stiffen. She simply let him hold her, her head settling against his shoulder with a trust that felt unearned. The ride back was silent except for the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the scrub. Thorne kept one arm around Naya, steadying her, while his other hand held the reins. Halfway back, she spoke. Why, one word, but it contained a universe of questions. Why did you save us? Why didn't you leave us? Why didn't you take what I offered? Thorne didn't answer right away. He watched the horizon where the ranch house was just beginning to appear as a dark smudge against the lighter sand. Finally, he said no one should have to pay with their body to stay alive. Silence. Then so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Not everyone thinks that way. I do. 3 syllables, but they were a promise. At the ranch, he carried Naya inside and laid her on the bed beside her sisters. All 5 of them together now. All 5 breathing, all 5 alive. He stepped back, surveying his work. They looked like refugees from a war, burned, bruised, broken, but alive. The youngest one, the one he'd cut down first, stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around with the confused expression of someone waking from a nightmare, trying to figure out which parts were real and which parts were dream. Her gaze landed on Thorne, and she flinched. Naya's hand shot out, catching her sister's wrist. It's okay, Naya said, her voice hoarse but steady. He saved us. He's safe. The word hung in the air like something fragile and precious. Safe. Thorne wondered if they'd ever felt safe before. Wondered what their lives had been like to end up hanging from posts in the desert like warnings written in flesh. Water's on the table, he said, gesturing to the pitcher he'd left. Food in the kitchen. I'll be outside if you need anything. He turned to leave. Wait. Naya's voice stopped him at the door. He turned back. She was sitting up now, ignoring the way her sisters tried to pull her back down. Her face was still purple with pooled blood, still ravaged by the sun, but her eyes were clear. What I said out there, she began. About bearing your children. Forget it. His voice was firmer than he intended, almost harsh. Naya blinked. You said it to save your sisters. Thorne continued, making his tone gentler. I understand. You don't owe me anything. Not your body. Not your gratitude. Nothing. He watched several emotions cross her face. Confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like grief. But you're free here, Thorne said. All of you. Free to stay as long as you need to heal. Free to leave whenever you want. I won't touch you. Won't demand anything. That's the only rule in this house. The 4 sisters were staring at him now, their eyes wide with an expression he couldn't quite read. Naya's throat worked as she swallowed. I don't understand, she whispered. Men don't. They always want. I'm not those men. 4 words. Simple, direct, true. The silence that followed was profound. Thorne could hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady. Could hear the wind outside rattling the shutters. Could hear one of the sisters, the second youngest, begin to cry soft sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. Naya just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the trap, for the lie, for the moment when his mask would slip and he'd reveal himself to be like all the others. She didn't find it. Finally, she nodded, just once, a sharp dip of her chin that seemed to cost her something. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried a different weight than they had in the desert. This time they sounded like the beginning of belief. Thorne left them, then closing the door gently behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the murmur of voices from inside the room. Apache words he didn't understand. Tones he recognized, fear, relief, confusion, wonder. He walked through his house seeing it with new eyes, the dust, the silence, the emptiness that had settled into every corner like fog. For 5 years this place had been a tomb. Now it held life again. He stepped outside into the brutal afternoon sun and looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there was the hanging field, the 5 posts, the blood-soaked sand, and somewhere out there was whoever had put those women on those posts. Thorne's jaw tightened. They'd come looking. Men who did things like that always did. They'd come to reclaim their property, to finish what they'd started, to send their message. And when they came, Thorne would be waiting. He walked to the barn, to the locked cabinet where he kept his guns. He hadn't touched them in years, had no need for them on a ranch where the only thing he killed was time. But he touched them now. The Winchester, the Colt, both clean, both oiled, both ready. He loaded them, both his hands moving with muscle memory that hadn't faded. Then he carried them back to the house and set them by the door where he could reach them quickly. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Thorne stood on his porch watching the light die, thinking about the women in his house. 5 lives he'd saved. 5 lives he'd have to protect. Behind him through the window he heard voices again, softer now, the sound of sisters comforting each other, the sound of healing beginning. Thorne pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his hair. It was grayer than it used to be, thinner. His face in the window's reflection showed a man who'd lived hard and loved once and lost everything. But maybe not everything. Maybe not yet. Inside, someone laughed. Just a small sound quickly stifled, as if the girl who'd made it had forgotten she was allowed to. Thorne's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. He settled into the chair on the porch, the Winchester across his knees, and watched the stars come out. One by one they appeared, pinpricks of light in an ocean of darkness. The desert at night was cold. The desert at night was silent. But inside his house there was warmth. There were voices. There was life. And for the first time in 5 years, Thorne Brennick felt something other than the weight of grief. He felt purpose. Tomorrow would bring questions. Tomorrow would bring complications. Tomorrow would bring whoever had hung those women from those posts, and blood would likely follow. But tonight, 5 women were alive who should have been dead. Tonight, that was enough. Thorne closed his eyes and listened to the night, to the wind, to the distant howl of coyotes, to the soft murmur of Apache voices drifting through his window like prayers. And in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw Mariah's face one last time. She was smiling. "Rest now," he whispered to her ghost. "I've got work to do." The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, bearing witness to a lone man on a porch in the middle of nowhere, cradling a rifle and guarding 5 broken birds who were learning slowly, painfully, to remember how to fly. The first light of dawn came soft through the window, painting the room in shades of rose and gold. Thorne had been awake for hours, sitting in the chair he dragged into the hallway outside the sisters' room. The Winchester lay across his lap, and his eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, but he didn't move. Inside he could hear breathing. 5 distinct rhythms, some deeper than others, all alive. That was enough. When the sun cleared the horizon fully, he stood joints protesting the long vigil. He was 50, not 20, and his body reminded him of that fact every morning. But he was alive, and so were they, and that mathematics worked in everyone's favor. He walked to the kitchen, his boots loud in the morning silence. Coffee first, then breakfast. Then he'd figure out what came next. The stove was cold. He built a fire in it, watching the kindling catch, remembering how Mariah used to do this while he was still in bed. She'd always been the early riser. He'd been the one who liked to watch the sunrise from beneath warm blankets, her body curved against his. He pushed the memory away. Not roughly, he'd learned that roughness only made ghosts cling harder, but gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't ready to enter. The coffee was boiling when he heard the first footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. It was the second youngest, the one with eyes that reminded him of a deer ready to bolt. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of the blankets he'd left her long, black hair tangled around her shoulders like a nest of shadows. She stared at him. He stared back. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing to the pot. She didn't answer, didn't move, just watched him with those enormous eyes deciding something. Finally, she nodded. Once, sharp. Thorne poured 2 cups added sugar to both. He didn't know if she liked it, sweet, but sugar helped with shock and held one out to her. She took 3 steps forward, stopped, took 2 more. Her hand darted out, snatched the cup, and retreated like a bird stealing seed from a hand it didn't trust. She sipped. Her eyes widened slightly. "Good," Thorne asked. Another nod. "What's your name?" She hesitated so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then barely above a whisper, "Tayan." "Tayan, oh," he repeated, committing it to memory. "I'm Thorne, but you probably know that." She nodded again, took another sip, then surprised him by speaking. "You sat outside all night." Not a question, a statement. "Yes." Why? Thorne considered the question. There were complex answers, guilt duty, the need to do something right after so many years of getting it wrong. But he settled for the simple truth. In case you needed something. Tayan studied him over the rim of her cup, and he had the unsettling feeling of being weighed on scales he couldn't see. Whatever she found, it must have satisfied something, because she took another step closer. "My sisters are waking," she said. "They'll be hungry. I can make eggs, bread, some salt pork." "We don't eat pork." "Eggs and bread, then." The ghost of something that might have been a smile touched her lips, then vanished. "I'll tell them," she said, and disappeared back down the hallway like smoke. Thorne stood alone in his kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, listening to the murmur of Apache voices from the other room. 5 women in his house. 5 strangers who'd fallen into his life like meteors burning and impossible to ignore. He started cracking eggs. By the time the food was ready, all 5 sisters had emerged. They moved as a unit, a flock of birds that had learned to fly in formation for survival. The youngest he'd learned her name was Yuma, clung to Naya's hand like a child, though she couldn't have been younger than 17. The fierce one, Takara, her name would be, positioned herself between the others, and Thorne, her body language, screaming protection, despite her obvious weakness. Only Naya met his eyes directly. "You didn't have to do this," she said, gesturing at the table he'd set. 5 plates, 5 cups, 5 portions of everything distributed evenly. "You need to eat." "We could have—" "Eat," Thorne interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll talk after." And they ate like people who'd forgotten what food tasted like. Not frantically, they had more discipline than that, but with a focus that spoke of deep hunger. Thorne sat at the far end of the table, nursing his coffee, watching them without seeming to watch. The 4th one, Imala, had burns on her shoulders that needed fresh bandages. Takara favored her left arm. Yuma had rope burns around her ankles that had gone deep, nearly to the bone. And Naya carried herself like someone who'd learned that showing weakness was an invitation for predators. When the plates were empty, silence settled over the table like dust. Thorne cleared his throat. "I need to know what happened. Who did this to you? Because they'll come looking, and I need to be ready." The sisters exchanged glances. Some wordless communication passed between them, the kind of silent language that siblings developed when they'd survived hell together. Finally, Naya spoke. "Our father was Chief Ahiga. He died 6 months ago." Her voice was steady, but Thorne heard the grief beneath it, old and deep. "After he died, a man came to our village. Called himself Darius Blackwood. Said our father owed him $5,000. Showed us papers with our father's mark on them. Your father borrowed money from a white man." Thorne kept his voice neutral. Naya's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Our father never touched a pen in his life. Couldn't write his own name, let alone sign a contract. But the papers had his mark, or something close enough, that the territorial court accepted them." Thorne's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before. Fake debts, forged marks, men who preyed on tribes after their leaders died, knowing there'd be no one with the authority to challenge them. "The court gave Blackwood the right to collect," Naya continued. "We had no money, no way to pay, so he took us instead. Said we'd work off the debt in his establishment in Denver." "Establishment?" Takara spat the word like poison. "He meant brothel." Yuma flinched. Amala put a hand on her arm. We refused, Naya said. So he decided to make an example. Hung us from those posts. Left us there to die slowly where anyone passing would see what happens to Indians who don't pay their debts. The room was silent except for the tick of the clock on the mantel. Thorne set down his coffee cup with careful precision. This Blackwood, what's he look like? Tall, gray hair, wears fine clothes like a gentleman, has a scar here. Naya drew a line across her left cheek with her finger. From a knife fight, someone said. He runs saloons, gaming houses, controls half the law in 3 counties. And he'll want you back. It wasn't a question. Yes, Naya said simply. We're worth money to him. And more than that, we're his reputation. If word spreads that 5 Indian girls defied him and lived it undermines everything he's built. Thorne nodded slowly, thinking. Blackwood. He'd heard the name before in the vague way you heard about storms brewing in distant territories. A man who'd built an empire on vice and violence, who'd bought enough law to make himself untouchable. Almost untouchable. There's a marshal in Silver Creek, Thorne said. Carson Riley. He's honest, or as honest as law gets out here. I'll send him a telegram. Tell him what happened. A white lawman won't believe 5 Apache women over a man like Blackwood, Takara said flatly. He will if I tell him, and if I show him those rope burns as evidence. Something shifted in Takara's expression. Not quite trust, but maybe the acknowledgement that trust might be possible. Why, Naya asked. The same question she'd asked yesterday, but with different weight now. Why are you doing this? You could have left us there. Or you could have brought us here and taken what I offered. You're risking your life for strangers. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow called harsh and lonely. 5 years ago, he said finally, my wife died. Fever took her while I was off trying to find help. I rode as hard as I could, but I wasn't fast enough. Wasn't smart enough. I got home and she was already gone. He paused, surprised at how much it still hurt to say it aloud. I couldn't save her, but I can save you, and maybe, he shrugged, maybe that means something. Naya's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. It means everything, she said softly. The moment stretched fragile and strange until Yuma broke it with a yawn she tried to stifle behind her hand. You should rest more, Thorne said, grateful for the interruption. All of you. Healing takes time. And you, Naya asked. When do you rest? After I send that telegram. He began clearing plates. Tyan moved to help him, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Imala. They worked in silence, an odd domestic choreography of strangers learning each other's rhythms. When the dishes were done, Thorne excused himself and walked to the barn. His horse, a gray gelding named Smoke, watched him approach with patient eyes. Need you to make a run, Thorne told him, saddling up. 10 miles to town and back. Think you can handle it? Smoke snorted, which Thorne chose to interpret as yes. The ride to town took 2 hours through country that was beautiful in its harshness. Red rocks, endless sky, the kind of emptiness that could swallow a man whole if he let it. The telegraph office was a lean-to attached to the general store. The operator, a nervous man named Wendell, looked up when Thorne walked in. Mr. Brennick, don't see you in town much. Need to send a message to Marshal Riley in Silver Creek. Wendell pulled out his pad. Go ahead. Thorne dictated carefully. 5 Apache women kidnapped and tortured by Darius Blackwood. Currently safe at my ranch. Need investigation immediately. Thorne Brennick. Wendell's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Darius Blackwood, Mr. Brennick, are you sure you want to send it? Something in Thorne's voice made Wendell swallow his objections. He tapped out the message, the telegraph key clicking like an insect's legs. Reply might take a few days, Wendell said. If Riley's in his office. I'll check back. Thorne paid turn to leave, then paused. Wendell, if anyone asks about this telegram, didn't see you today, Mr. Brennick. Don't know what you're talking about. Thorne nodded and left. The ride back was slower. He stopped at the creek that ran through his property, let Smoke drink while he studied the horizon. Looking for dust. For riders. For any sign that Blackwood had already sent men. Nothing but wind and sky and the distant cry of a hawk. At the ranch, he found the sisters had emerged from their room. Takara was on the porch, eyes scanning the desert with the intensity of a sentry. Tyan and Amala were in the kitchen organizing supplies with the quiet efficiency of women who'd learned to make do with little. Yuma was in the barn sitting cross-legged in the hay humming something soft and sad, and Naya was waiting for him by the door. "You sent the telegram." "Yes." "And now we wait and we prepare." He carried the Winchester inside, checked its action, set it by the door. Then he went to the cabinet and pulled out his other guns. The Colt revolver, the shotgun he used for close work, the rifle with the scope that could reach out and touch a man at 300 yards. Naya watched him lay them out on the table. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. Your sisters." "Takara does. Tyen can learn. The others." She shrugged. "We'll see." Over the next 3 days, the ranch transformed into something resembling a fortress. Thorne taught Tyen the basics of rifle work, pleased to discover she had a natural eye for it. Takara, as promised, was already proficient, better than proficient actually. She could put 3 shots through the same hole at 50 yards. Imala turned out to have a gift with horses. Smoke, who was usually standoffish with strangers, followed her around like a puppy. She could read their moods, anticipate their movements, communicate with them in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Yuma was the scout, small, quick with eyes that could spot movement at distances that made Thorne squint. He set her to watching the approaches to the ranch, teaching her the signal system he'd used years ago when Comanche raids were still common. 1 whistle for riders from the east, 2 for the west, 3 for trouble close. And Naya was everywhere and nowhere, helping Tyen with her aim, discussing strategy with Takara, comforting Yuma when the nightmares came, organizing supplies with military precision, taking watch shifts that let Thorne sleep for the first time in days. She moved through his house like she'd always been there, rearranging things with a confidence that should have annoyed him, but somehow didn't. On the 3rd night, she found him on the porch after the others had gone to bed. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Old habit, vigilance." She settled into the chair beside him, close enough that he could smell whatever soap she'd used. Something with sage in it, he thought. "We can't stay here forever," she said quietly. "You know that." "I know. When Blackwood comes. If he comes." "When he comes," she repeated firmly, "you'll be outnumbered. He'll bring 20 men, maybe more. You can't fight that alone." "Won't be alone. I'll have you and your sisters." She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. 5 women and 1 man against Blackwood's army. Those aren't good odds. I've survived worse odds. When Thorne was quiet for a moment, watching the stars wheel overhead. "Never," he admitted, "but there's a first time for everything." This time she definitely laughed. Short, sharp, but genuine. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds. The distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through dead grass, the creak of the house settling. "Thorne," Naya said eventually, her voice soft, "what I said out there in the desert, about bearing your children, I meant it." His hand tightened on the Winchester. "You were desperate." "I was, but I also meant it." She turned to look at him, and even in the darkness he could feel the weight of her gaze. "You're a good man, a strong man, the kind of man a woman would be proud to give children to." "Naya." "I'm not offering out of debt," she interrupted. "I'm telling you as a fact. If you wanted me, I would say yes, willingly, gladly." Thorne's throat felt tight. "You don't know me. You've been here 3 days. I know you sat outside our door all night. I know you sent a telegram that might get you killed. I know you're teaching my sisters to defend themselves instead of trying to control them. I know, her voice caught slightly. "I know you looked at 5 dying women and decided we were worth saving." "Anyone would have." "No," she said flatly. "They wouldn't have. And we both know it." The silence that followed was different, charged, full of things neither of them was ready to say. Finally, Thorne stood. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow we start building barricades." Naya stood too close enough now that he could see her face clearly in the starlight. Young, beautiful, fierce. "One more thing," she said. "What?" She rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, quick. Went over before he could react. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Then she was gone, disappearing into the house like a ghost, leaving Thorne alone with the night and the sudden thundering of his heart. He touched his cheek where her lips had been feeling like a boy of 20 instead of a man of 50. This was complicated. This was dangerous. This was... The whistle cut through his thoughts like a knife. 3 short bursts. Trouble. Close. Thorne grabbed the Winchester and was moving before the third whistle faded, his boots pounding across the porch. He could see Yuma silhouetted on the barn roof pointing east. Riders. 6 of them, maybe 7 visible in the moonlight as dark shapes against darker ground. Behind him the door burst open. Takara emerged rifle in hand, Naya right behind her. "How many?" Naya asked. 6, maybe more. Blackwood's men? Who else? They came like thunder horses at full gallop, raising dust that looked like smoke in the moonlight. They rode straight up to the house, not bothering with stealth, and stopped 20 yards out. The leader was a broad man with a beard that could hide a family of birds. He stayed mounted, hands visible on his saddle horn, but Thorne could see the gun belt underneath his coat. "You Thorne Brennick," the man called. "I am. Name's Dutch. I work for Mr. Blackwood. He'd like his property returned." "Don't have any property of his." Dutch smiled, revealing teeth that had seen better decades. 5 Apache girls. You got them. We want them back." "They're not property. They're free women." "That's where you're wrong, friend. Mr. Blackwood has legal papers. Court-certified debt contracts. Those girls owe him $5,000. Can't pay. They're his to do with as he pleases. That's the law." "The law's wrong." Dutch's smile faded. "This can go easy or hard, Brennick. Easy way, you hand them over. Now we ride off, everyone lives. Hard way." He gestured at the riders behind him. "Well, you do the math." Thorne felt Naya move up beside him, felt rather than saw Takara position herself at the window with a clear line of sight. "Here's my counteroffer," Thorne said. "You ride back to Blackwood. Tell him Marshal Carson Riley is investigating his contracts. Tell him if he wants these women, he can take it up with federal law." Dutch laughed. Actually laughed. "Riley, you think Riley scares Mr. Blackwood? Half the marshals in the territory are on his payroll. Riley will investigate, sure. He'll investigate real careful. And then he'll find that everything is perfectly legal. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, you're not taking these women." The laughter died. "You're making a mistake, old man." "Won't be my first." Dutch's hand twitched toward his gun. The crack of Takara's rifle split the night. Dirt exploded 2 inches from Dutch's horse's front hoof. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. "Next one goes through your hat," Takara called from the window. "The one after that goes through your head." Dutch fought his horse under control, his face purple with rage. "You're dead," he screamed. "You hear me? Dead, all of you." "Then come try it," Thorne said calmly. "Right now, 6 of you. 6 of us. Let's see how the math works out." For a long moment, Dutch glared at him, weighing odds. His men shifted uneasily. They'd signed up for collecting girls, not getting shot. Finally, Dutch wheeled his horse around. "You got 3 days, Brennick. 3 days to think it over. After that, we come back with 30 of the men, and we burn this place to the ground." They rode off at a gallop, dust rising like a curtain behind them. When they were by, Thorne lowered the Winchester and released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," Naya said quietly, "I guess that's that." "I guess so." She looked at him, her face unreadable in the darkness. 3 days. 3 days, he agreed. "What do we do?" "Oh." Thorne looked at the 5 women standing with him. Naya, Takara, Tayan, and Amala and Yuma. 5 strangers who'd become something more in the space of 72 hours. "We get ready," he said, "and we pray that Marshal Riley gets here before Blackwood does." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Riley wasn't coming in time. When Blackwood returned, it would be war. And Thorne Brennick, 50 years old and tired down to his bones, would have to become what he'd sworn he'd never be again. A killer. The telegram arrived on the morning of the 4th day, the day after Dutch's ultimatum. Thorne had ridden to town at dawn, leaving the sisters fortifying the ranch. 3 days had passed since he'd first brought them home. 3 days of recovery, then training, then Dutch's visit. Now the clock was ticking. Wendell looked nervous when Thorne walked into the telegraph office, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in rough water. "Message came through an hour ago," he said, sliding the paper across the counter. "From Marshal Riley." Thorne unfolded it, read the sparse words, "Received your message. Stop. Investigating Blackwood contracts. Stop. Will arrive your location 10 days. Stop. Keep them safe until then. Stop, Riley. 10 days. Thorne read it again as if the numbers might change through sheer force of will. They didn't. Problem, Wendell asked, though his face said he already knew the answer. Dutch gave me 3 days. Riley needs 10. That's bad math, Mr. Brennick. Yeah. Thorne folded the telegram and tucked it in his pocket. It is. He bought ammunition on the way out. All the rounds Wendell had in stock, rifle, pistol, shotgun shells. The storekeeper's eyes went wide when Thorne laid out the money, but he was smart enough not to ask questions. The ride back was slow. Thorne kept Smoke to a walk, using the time to think, to plan, to accept what was coming. 30 men, Dutch had said, maybe more. Men who killed for money, who followed Blackwood because he paid well and protected his own. Men who wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't show mercy, wouldn't stop until the job was done. Against that one aging rancher and 5 women, only 2 of whom could really shoot. The math was simple, and it was bad. But Thorne had learned long ago that math didn't account for everything. Desperation was a multiplier. So was righteous anger, and the will to protect something precious that could make heroes out of ordinary people, or corpses. When he reached the ranch, he found it transformed. Takara had supervised the construction of a chest-high barricade around the porch, built from everything they could find: fence posts, barnwood, even Mariah's old wardrobe dragged from the bedroom and filled with sand. Windows had been barricaded except for gun slots. The water barrel had been moved inside. They were turning his home into a fortress. Naya met him at the door, her face tight with worry. 10 days, Thorne said before she could ask. Riley needs 10 days. Her eyes closed briefly. And we have 2 left. Yes. She nodded once, accepting it the way a soldier accepts orders. No complaints, no tears, just acknowledgement and adaptation. Then we work faster, she said. They did. That afternoon, Thorne taught them all the things he'd hoped he'd never have to teach anyone again. Fields of fire, interlocking sectors, how to reload in the dark, how to breathe through fear, how to kill efficiently because hesitation would get you killed first. Takara absorbed it all with grim focus. Tayan learned quickly, her hands steady despite the tremor Thorne could see in her shoulders. Even Imala, gentle Imala, who spoke to horses like they were children, learned to sight down a rifle barrel with cold precision. Only Yuma struggled. She was too young, too small, too shaken by everything that had happened. Her hands shook when she held the gun. She flinched at every shot. It's okay, Thorne told her, crouching beside her as she fought back tears. You don't have to shoot. We need you for other things. Watching, warning, running messages between positions. Can you do that? She nodded, relief flooding her face. I can do that. As the sun set on the 5th day, 2 days before Dutch's deadline, they gathered around the kitchen table. All 6 of them tired and dusty and silent. Naya had made a stew from the supplies Thorne had brought back, stretching it to feed everyone. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it was food, and right now that was everything. Day after tomorrow, Thorne said into the quiet. They'll come day after tomorrow. No one argued. They all knew it was true. You don't have to stay, he continued, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. Any of you. There's still time to run. Head north to the tribal lands. They won't follow you there. And leave you. Takara's voice was sharp as broken glass. 1 man against 30. I've made my choice. You should make yours. We already did, Naya said quietly. We chose to stay. Together. You could die here. We could have died in that desert. You gave us a second chance at life. We won't waste it running. Thorne looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that made his chest tighten. Not just determination, not just gratitude, something deeper. Something that terrified him more than Blackwood's 30 guns. Naya, she held up a hand, stopping him. Not now, after. When we've survived this, then we talk. If we survive, Thorne thought, but didn't say. They finished eating in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Then Takara took first watch, positioning herself on the roof with the scoped rifle. Tayan took the barn, Imala the east window. Yuma curled up in the cellar, ready to run messages. That left Thorne and Naya alone in the kitchen. She helped him clean the dishes, moving through his space with a familiarity that felt both foreign and achingly right. When the last plate was dried and put away, she didn't leave. She stood there, hands folded, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. 5 years, she said finally. You've been alone for 5 years. Yes, that's a long time. It is. Do you, she paused, searching for words. Do you ever wish you weren't alone anymore? Thorne's throat felt tight. He knew what she was asking, knew what she was offering. And God help him, he wanted it. Wanted her. Wanted the warmth of another person in his bed, the sound of another voice in the morning, the simple human comfort of not being solitary. But she was 24. He was 50. She'd been traumatized, hung from a post, offered herself out of desperation less than a week ago. Taking advantage of that, even if she was willing now, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd promised. Naya, you don't owe me anything. I know, I've told you that before. This isn't about debt. Then what is it about? She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. It's about choice. You gave me back the right to choose. And I choose not to be afraid anymore. Not to wait for permission to feel. Not to let trauma steal everything good from me. Her hand found his fingers intertwining. I choose you, Thorne Brennick. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are when you don't have to be saving anyone. His other hand came up, cupping her face with a gentleness that surprised them both. You deserve better than an old man with ghosts. You deserve better than dying alone defending people you barely know. Touché. They stood there, caught in a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Tomorrow might bring death. Probably would. But tonight, right now, there was just this two damaged people finding unexpected warmth in the cold desert night. Thorne leaned down. Naya rose up. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft, at first tentative, then deeper. Searching. Finding. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Naya smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Come to bed, she whispered. Naya, I can't. Not for that, not yet. Just don't sleep alone tonight. Please. How could he refuse that? They walked to his room, the room he'd shared with Mariah, the room he'd avoided for 5 years, except to collapse in exhausted sleep. Naya looked around, taking in the sparse furniture, the dust, the overwhelming emptiness. Tell me about her, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Mariah, yes, so he did. He told her about meeting Mariah at a church social in Silver Creek, how she'd smiled at him with eyes like summer sky, how they'd courted for 6 months, married in the spring, built this ranch together from nothing, how she'd wanted children but the babies never came, how she'd filled the emptiness by filling their home with light and laughter instead, how the fever had taken her in 3 days, burning through her like wildfire while he'd ridden desperately for help that arrived too late. Naya listened without interrupting, her hand finding his in the darkness. She sounds wonderful, Naya said when he finished. She was. Do you think, Naya hesitated, do you think she'd approve of this, of me? Thorne thought about it, really thought. Tried to imagine what Mariah would say if she could see him now sheltering 5 Apache women, preparing for a war, holding the hand of a girl young enough to be his daughter. I think, he said slowly, she'd tell me to stop living like I died with her. I think she'd want me to be happy again. And does this make you happy? He looked at Naya, fierce, broken, brave Naya, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 5 years beginning finally to thaw. Yeah, he said softly. It does. They lay down together on top of the blankets, fully clothed, not touching except where their hands intertwined. And for the first time since Mariah died, Thorne fell asleep with another person's breathing to anchor him to the world. He woke to gunfire, not close, several hundred yards out, but unmistakable. The flat crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns. Shouts, the scream of horses. Dawnlight filtered through the window. He'd slept maybe 4 hours. Thorne was on his feet and moving before full consciousness returned, grabbing his rifle, checking the load. Beside him, Naya was already up, pulling on her boots with practiced speed. It's starting, she said. No. Thorne cocked his head, listening. It's not them. The shooting's coming from the road. From town. They ran outside together. From the roof, Takara shouted down, Riders coming fast, but they're running from something, not toward us. Thorne scrambled up to the roof, bringing his scope. Through it, he could see 3 riders pushing their horses hard, looking back over their shoulders. Behind them, maybe a quarter mile back, a larger group pursued. That's Dutch's men, Takara said, pointing at the fleeing riders. I recognize the bearded one, but who's chasing them? The scope brought the answer into sharp focus, men in dusters riding hard, the morning sun glinting off badges pinned to their chests. Law, Thorne breathed. That's law. And leading them on a black horse that moved like liquid shadow was a man Thorne recognized even at this distance. Carson Riley, Marshal Carson Riley, who wasn't supposed to arrive for 8 more days. The fleeing riders made it to the ranch and wheeled around, dismounted, took cover behind rocks and scrub. Behind them, Riley's men spread out in a practiced skirmish line and stopped just out of effective rifle range. Riley himself rode forward alone, hands visible and empty. Dutch Keller, his voice carried across the desert like a bell. You're under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Dutch's response was a rifle shot that kicked up dust 5 feet to Riley's left. I'll take that as you're resisting arrest, Riley called back, surprisingly calm. He turned his horse and rode back to his men. What followed was quick and brutal. Riley's deputies, 15 of them, all experienced manhunters, advanced in 2 groups using cover, laying down suppressing fire that was precise and devastating. Dutch's 3 men tried to return fire, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. It was over in 5 minutes. 2 of Dutch's men threw down their weapons and surrendered. The 3rd Dutch himself tried to run and took a rifle round through the thigh. He went down screaming. Riley's men secured them, binding hands with practiced efficiency. Then Riley himself rode toward the ranch, slow and easy hands, where Thorne could see them. Thorne Brennick, he called when he was close enough for conversation. That's me. Carson Riley, we've been corresponding. You're early, 8 days early. Riley grinned, a flash of white teeth in a sun-weathered face. Got your telegram and figured it couldn't wait. Borrowed some horses, rode hard. Caught these 3 heading into town to meet with more of Blackwood's men. He nodded toward the prisoners. They were quite talkative once I explained the alternative to talking. And Blackwood, in custody as of 3 hours ago, raided his saloon in Silver Creek with a federal warrant. Found enough evidence to hang him, twice forged contracts, trafficking ledgers, payoff records. He's done. Thorne felt his knees go weak, just like that. After all the fear, all the preparation, and all the certainty of coming violence, just like that, it was over. The sisters, Riley asked, they're safe. They're here, safe. Good, I'll need their testimony for the trial, but first, Riley dismounted, walking closer, lowering his voice. You should know, Blackwood had connections, deep ones. Federal Marshal Hayes was on his payroll, so were 2 territorial judges and half a dozen local sheriffs. Hayes' brain, Thorne's stomach dropped. Hayes was Riley's superior, was on his payroll, past tense. When I started investigating, Hayes tried to shut me down. That's when I knew the corruption went high. So I went higher, straight to the territorial governor, showed him what I'd found. Riley's smile was grim. Hayes is in federal custody now, along with 3 judges and 8 lawmen from 4 counties. This is going to be the biggest corruption trial the territory's ever seen. Yet in the sisters' debt, the contracts are forgeries. I've got 3 handwriting experts who'll testify to it. I've also got testimony from 12 other families who were victimized the same way fake debts force labor threats of violence. Blackwood ran this scheme for years. Riley pulled a document from his coat and handed it to Thorne. That's a court order. Effective immediately, all debts allegedly owed to Darius Blackwood are voided. The women are legally free. Thorne stared at the paper, at the official seals and signatures, and felt something enormous lift from his shoulders. Free. They were free. There's more, Riley said quietly. We found records. Blackwood was planning to sell them to a brothel in Denver. Had a buyer lined up, $3,000 for all 5. That's what your 5 lives were worth to him. The number hung in the air like something obscene. They're worth more than that, Thorne said. I know. That's why I rode through 2 nights to get here. Because I've got a sister. Riley's voice went rough. Had a sister. She disappeared 10 years ago. 14 years old. We never found her. Never knew what happened. But I've got my suspicions. Men like Blackwood, he trailed off, jaw tight. Men like Blackwood don't get to win. Not on my watch. Behind them, the ranch door opened. Naya emerged, followed by her sisters, all of them staring at the scene with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief. Riley removed his hat. Ladies, Marshal Carson Riley. I'm here to tell you that you're free. Legally, officially, permanently free. Blackwood's in custody. His organization is being dismantled. You're safe now." For a moment, no one moved. Then Yuma made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and collapsed against Amala. Tayan pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Takara stood frozen as if movement might shatter the moment and reveal it as a dream. And Naya looked at Thorne with eyes that held everything. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper that made his heart stutter. "Thank you," she said to Riley. Then turning to Thorne, "Thank you." The next hours passed in a blur. Riley's men secured the prisoners, including Dutch, who glared at everyone with impotent rage as they loaded him onto a horse. Riley took statements from each of the sisters, writing carefully, his face growing darker with each story. When he was done, he stood and addressed them all. "The trial will be in 3 weeks. I'll need you all to testify. Can you make it to Silver Creek?" "We'll be there," Naya said. Riley nodded, then turned to Thorne. "You did good work here, Brennick. Saved 5 lives. That's worth remembering." "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Riley said firmly. "You did what a good man does. There's a difference." After Riley and his men left, riding back towards Silver Creek with their prisoners in tow, silence settled over the ranch like a blanket. Thorne stood on the porch, watching the dust from their departure to settle, trying to process what had happened. They'd prepared for war. They'd been ready to die. And instead, Salvation had arrived on horseback 8 days early, wearing a badge. The sisters gathered in the kitchen, speaking in low Apache voices. Thorne gave them space, retreating to the porch. An hour later, Takara emerged. "We've decided," she said. "The 4 of us will return to our people in 3 days. We need to tell them we're safe, to mourn our father properly, to heal." "And Naya?" Takara's eyes were unreadable. "She hasn't decided yet." The next 3 days were strange. The house filled with preparations, mending clothes, gathering supplies, the sisters teaching each other songs they'd almost forgotten. Yuma grew more animated, talking excitedly about seeing friends again, about sleeping in a proper teepee, about dancing at the next tribal gathering. Tayan and Amala were quieter, but clearly eager. Only Takara seemed conflicted, watching Thorne with thoughtful eyes whenever she thought he wasn't looking. And Naya moved through the days with a careful distance, polite, helpful, but the warmth from that night they'd slept side by side was gone, replaced by something Thorne couldn't quite name. On the second night, Takara found Thorne on the porch. "My sister is miserable," she said without preamble. "She made her choice." "No, you made it for her by not telling her what you want." Takara's eyes were fierce. "She offered herself to you twice, once in desperation, once in freedom. Both times you were honorable, noble, but now she thinks you don't want her. That's not—" "Then tell her, before it's too late." Takara left. Thorne sat alone, her words echoing. But he didn't seek Naya out, didn't know what to say. How do you tell a woman half your age that you want her to stay when you know she deserves better? When you know the right thing is to let her go? On the morning they were scheduled to leave, Thorne woke before dawn. He made coffee, cooked breakfast, tried to pretend his chest didn't feel like someone had hollowed it out with a dull spoon. The sisters came down one by one, dressed for travel, carrying their bundles. Thorne had given them horses, good ones, the best he had, along with enough supplies to get them safely to the tribal lands 30 miles north. They ate in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Takara stood. "We should go. We want to reach the border before dark." The others nodded, rising. They filed outside, began securing their bundles to the horses. Thorne helped, checking straps, adjusting stirrups, doing anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. When everything was ready, each sister came to him in turn. Yuma hugged him fiercely, her small arms surprisingly strong. "You are like the father we lost," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us back our lives." Tayan kissed his cheek. "You taught me I could be strong. I won't forget that." Imala pressed something into his hand, a small carving of a horse, beautiful and delicate. "So you remember us," she said simply. Takara gripped his shoulder, her eyes fierce. "You're a warrior, Thorne Brennick. Whether you wear it or not, it's been an honor fighting beside you." Then there was only Naya. She stood apart from her sisters, her horse's reins in her hand, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Naya," he started, not knowing what he wanted to say. "Take care of yourself, Thorne." You too. She nodded, turned toward her horse, and stopped. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her back to him. Then she spun around, closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, and grabbed the front of his shirt. Do you want me to go? She demanded, her voice fierce. Tell me the truth, not what's reasonable or appropriate or right. Tell me what you want. Thorne stared at her, at this fierce, beautiful, complicated woman who'd stumbled into his life a week ago and turned everything upside down. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. What he wanted to say, stay, build a life with me. Let me love you the way you deserve. But he'd spent 3 days telling himself that asking her to stay would be another cage, however gilded, that giving her freedom meant letting her go. But looking at her now, at the challenge in her eyes, the demand for honesty, he realized he'd been a coward, hiding behind nobility, behind what was right. No, he said, his voice rough. I don't want you to go. I want you to stay. I want, he swallowed hard. I want to know who you are when you're not surviving. I want to hear you laugh. I want to watch you discover what you love when fear isn't making all your choices for you. I want, she kissed him, not gentle this time, hard, desperate, her hands fisting in his shirt, his arms coming around her waist, lifting her off her feet. The kiss tasted like coffee and hope, and something so fierce it made his knees weak. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Naya pressed her forehead to his. Then I'm staying, she whispered. Your sisters will visit often, but my place, and she pulled back to look at him. My place is here, with you, if you'll have me. Naya, you're 24, I'm 50. People will, I don't care what people say, do you? He thought about town gossip and raised eyebrows and all the reasons this was complicated. Then he thought about going back to an empty house, an empty bed, an empty life. No, he said, I don't. Behind them, Takara cleared her throat. Sister, are you sure? Naya turned in Thorne's arms, not letting go of him. I'm sure. Tell our people I'm safe. Tell them I've found home. The sisters exchanged glances. Some wordless communication passed between them. Then one by one they smiled. We'll tell them, Takara said, and we'll visit in a month, to make sure he's treating you right. He will be. He better be, Takara said, giving Thorne a look that promised violence if he failed. Or he'll answer to me. More hugs, more tears, more promises to visit and write and stay in touch. Then the four sisters mounted their horses and rode north toward home, leaving Naya standing beside Thorne in the dust of their departure. When they were out of sight, Naya turned to him. So what now? Thorne smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. Now we figure out what comes next, together. 3 weeks later, they rode to Silver Creek for the trial. The courthouse was packed, people standing in the aisles, crowding the windows, spilling out into the street. Darius Blackwood sat at the defendant's table in chains. His fine clothes rumpled, his face carved from stone. The trial lasted 4 days. Naya and her sisters testified, their voices strong and clear, as they described what Blackwood had done. 12 other families told similar stories: fake debts, stolen children, lives destroyed. The handwriting experts showed how the signatures were forged. The account books revealed years of trafficking and corruption. Former Marshal Hayes, trying to save himself, turned state's evidence and detailed exactly how deep Blackwood's network ran. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a territorial appointee brought in specifically because he had no connection to Blackwood, sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison, plus restitution to all his victims, plus forfeiture of all his assets. When the gavel fell, Blackwood finally showed emotion. Rage twisted his face as guards dragged him away, and he screamed threats that echoed through the courthouse. But they were empty threats. He was done. Outside, Riley found Thorne and Naya in the crowd. Justice, he said simply, doesn't happen often out here, but when it does, it's worth savoring. Thank you, Naya said, for everything. Thank my sister, wherever she is. She's the reason I never stop hunting men like Blackwood. Riley tipped his hat. You two take care of each other. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. When they arrived, Thorne helped Naya down from her horse, and she didn't let go of his hand. Thorne, she said, I need to tell you something. Something in her voice made him tense. What is it? I think I'm pregnant. The world stopped. You're pregnant. I've missed 2 cycles. I'm tired all the time. I'm sick every morning. And I feel different. Thorne stared at her, his mind refusing to process the words. But we haven't. That night, Naya said softly, after you came back from sending the telegram, we didn't go all the way, but she blushed. There was enough. He remembered, in the dark, in the quiet, in the moment when they'd both needed comfort more than air. Her body against his, the boundaries they'd carefully maintained, but not carefully enough apparently. Are you angry? She asked when he didn't speak. Angry, no. He searched for words and came up empty. I don't know what I am. Scared. Terrified. Me too. They stood there, hands clasped, both trembling. I couldn't save Mariah, Thorne said finally, his voice breaking. I couldn't protect her. I couldn't keep her alive. And now you're telling me you're carrying my child, and I'm 50 years old, and I don't know if I can. Naya grabbed his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Mariah's death wasn't your fault. The fever was. The distance was. Bad luck was. But you weren't. Her thumb stroked his cheeks. And this child, our child, is being born into different circumstances, with modern medicine close by. With me healthy and strong, with you older, yes, but also wiser, more patient, more appreciative of how precious life is. Naya, do you want this baby? The question hung between them, huge and terrifying. Could he? He'd given up on the idea of children years ago, had buried that dream with Mariah. And now here it was, resurrected, impossible, real. Yes, he whispered, God help me, yes. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. Then we're doing this, together. The next months passed in a blur of preparation. Thorne rode to Silver Creek and came back with a doctor who examined Naya and pronounced her healthy and the baby developing normally. He bought medical supplies, baby clothes, everything the doctor recommended. Naya's sisters visited often, usually staying for days at a time. They helped prepare the house, turning the small room next to the bedroom into a nursery. They taught Thorne Apache prayers for safe delivery. They told stories of their own mother giving birth, of tribal traditions and remedies. And slowly, painfully, wonderfully, Thorne began to believe it might actually work. But the fear never fully left, especially as Naya's belly grew, as the baby became undeniably real. Every night, Thorne would wake in a cold sweat, remembering Mariah's fever, her pain, her final gasping breaths. Naya knew. She always knew. I'm not her, she'd whisper in the dark, holding his hand to her belly so he could feel the baby kick. I'm not Mariah, and you're not the same man you were then. We're writing a different story. One morning in the 7th month, Thorne woke to find Naya wasn't beside him. Panic seized him, irrational, immediate, overwhelming. He threw off the blankets and ran through the house, calling her name. He found her in the barn, grooming smoke, humming softly. Naya, what the hell? You can't just... He stopped, seeing the tears on her face. Hey, he said, gentler, now approaching slowly. What's wrong? I can't sleep. Every position hurts. The baby won't stop kicking. I'm huge and ungainly, and I can't even see my own feet anymore. She laughed through tears. And I'm terrified. What if I'm a terrible mother? What if the baby doesn't survive? What if I don't? Stop. Thorne pulled her into his arms, mindful of her belly between them. You're going to be an amazing mother. You're strong and brave and fiercely protective. That baby couldn't ask for better. And you, she asked into his chest, what kind of father will you be? Terrified, probably overprotective, definitely old enough to be mistaken for the grandfather. She laughed again, this time with more joy than fear. But present, Thorne continued, and grateful, and so damn determined to do this right that I'll probably drive you crazy. I can live with that. They stood there in the barn, holding each other as the sun rose, painting the world in new light. On a cold day in late February, 1 month before the baby was due, Thorne was chopping wood behind the house when the pain hit. It started in his chest, a crushing pressure, like someone had wrapped iron bands around his ribs. His left arm went numb. The axe fell from nerveless fingers. He tried to call out, but his voice wouldn't work. Tried to move, but his legs folded. He hit the ground hard, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue. The world grayed at the edges. Through the fog, he heard screaming, running footsteps, hands on his face. Thorne, stay with me. Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave me. Naya. That was Naya's voice, rough with terror. He tried to tell her it was okay, that he'd be fine, but the darkness was rising like a tide and he couldn't fight it. The last thing he heard before consciousness fled was her voice, ragged with sobs. Please, please don't go. Not now, not when we're so close, please. When Thorne woke, the first thing he saw was Naya's face. She looked terrible, pale, hollow-eyed, her hair wild around her shoulders, but alive, present, here. How long? His voice came out as a croak. 2 days. You've been unconscious for 2 days. Her hand gripped his so hard it hurt. The doctor came from Silver Creek. He said your heart. He said you overworked it. Stress and age and too much physical labor. The baby, is fine. I'm fine. You're the one who almost died, you stubborn old fool. He tried to smile. Not that old. Old enough to collapse from a heart episode. Old enough that the doctor said you need complete rest for at least a month. Old enough that I've been sitting here for 2 days thinking about how I'd raise our child alone if you died. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Don't you do that to me, Thorne Brennick. Don't you save my life just to leave me anyway. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be alive. Be careful. Be here for our child. I will, I promise. She lowered her forehead to their joined hands, and he felt her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Later, when she'd cried herself out and fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, Thorne lay awake thinking. He'd spent 5 years mourning Mariah. 5 years convinced he'd failed her, that he'd let her die through his own inadequacy. 5 years punishing himself with isolation and grief. And now here he was being saved by the woman he'd saved. Roles reversed, caretaker becoming patient, protector needing protection. There was something profound in that, something about how love wasn't a one-way transaction, how saving and being saved were parts of the same cycle, how strength came from allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Over the next weeks, Naya became his nurse, his tyrant, his guardian. She enforced the doctor's orders with ruthless efficiency, forbidding him from lifting anything heavier than a book, from working outside, from doing any of the 100 things he normally did. At first, it drove him crazy, but gradually he learned to accept it, learned to let her care for him the way he'd cared for her, learned that strength sometimes meant admitting weakness. How does it feel? Naya asked one afternoon as he sat on the porch, forbidden from going further. Frustrating, humbling, strange. Strange how I've spent my whole life being the strong one, the provider, the protector. Having you take care of me, it's emasculating. I was going to say enlightening. She raised an eyebrow. You're showing me what you felt, Thorne explained, when you were helpless and I helped, when you needed saving and couldn't do it yourself. I'm finally understanding what it cost you to accept help. And it's terrifying and necessary, and maybe that's what love is, taking turns being strong, taking turns being saved. Naya smiled and kissed the top of his head. For a 50-year-old man who almost died, you're getting quite wise. 6 weeks after his collapse, Thorne woke to Naya shaking him in the pre-dawn dark. It's time, she said, her voice tight with pain. He was on his feet before his brain fully engaged heart hammering, then remembered the doctor's orders and forced himself to move slowly. How far apart are the contractions? 10 minutes, maybe less. I'll get the doctor. No time. He's 2 hours away in Silver Creek. This baby's not waiting. Thorne stared at her, fear and exhilaration warring in his chest. Then we do this ourselves. They'd prepared for this possibility. Had supplies, ready instructions from the doctor, memorized a plan in place. But theory was different from practice, and as Naya's contractions grew closer and stronger, Thorne felt the old panic rising. What if something went wrong? What if he lost them both? What if his heart gave out again mid-delivery? What if Thorne, Naya's voice cut through his spiral, I need you here, with me, not lost in fear. He took a breath, let it out, took another. I'm here. Good. Because this baby is coming, whether we're ready or not. The next hours were the longest of Thorne's life. Longer than waiting for the doctor who never came for Mariah. Longer than hanging from that post must have been for Naya. Longer than any battle or hardship or grief. But different too, because this time he wasn't helpless. This time, he could help supporting Naya through contractions, following the doctor's instructions, staying present and focused even when fear screamed at him to run. And Naya was magnificent, fierce and strong and unbreakable even in the depths of pain. She didn't scream or beg or plead. She breathed and pushed and fought with the same determination she'd shown hanging from that post, refusing to surrender. As the sun rose, painting the room in golden light, their daughter entered the world. She came out screaming, healthy lungs, strong voice, furious at being evicted from her warm home. Thorne caught her with trembling hands, this tiny, perfect, impossible creature, and felt his heart crack open in ways he'd forgotten were possible. "A girl," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "We have a daughter." Naya, exhausted and radiant, reached for the baby. "Let me see her." He placed their daughter in her arms, watching as Naya counted fingers and toes, checked eyes and ears, examined every inch with a mother's critical eye. "She's perfect," Naya breathed, "like her mother." They sat there as the sun climbed higher, the three of them cocooned in wonder and exhaustion and overwhelming love. "What should we name her?" Thorne asked eventually. Naya thought for a moment, then smiled. "Mariah," she said, "for the woman who came before, and Dakota for my father." "Mariah Dakota Brennick." Thorne's throat tightened. "Are you sure using Mariah's name?" "I'm sure. She was part of your story, and our daughter is the next chapter. It feels right to honor both." He nodded, unable to speak. Later, after Naya had slept and woken and nursed the baby after Thorne had ridden to Silver Creek to fetch the doctor, who examined mother and child and pronounced both healthy after the initial rush of adrenaline faded into bone-deep weariness, they lay together in bed. The baby slept between them in a small basket wrapped in blankets Naya's sisters had made. Her tiny face was peaceful, her breathing soft and steady. "I almost died out there in the desert," Naya said quietly, "hanging from that post. And part of me did die, the part that believed I was only worth what men decided I was worth." She touched the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. "But you gave me the chance to be reborn, to choose my own value, to choose you. And now we've made this perfect, beautiful life that exists because we both chose each other when we could have chosen to stay broken." Thorne took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I spent 5 years thinking I was done, that my life was over, that love was something I'd had once and lost forever." He looked at his daughter, at his wife, and at the family he'd never expected to have. "Thank you for proving me wrong. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for saving me back." Outside, the desert wind whispered through the valley. Inside, a small family lay together in the warm lamplight, bound by choice and love, and the fierce determination to protect what they'd built. Thorne thought of the hanging field of 5 women who should have died but didn't. Thought of Naya's desperate offer, "Plant your seed in me, save my sisters." Thought of how far they'd come from that moment of desperation to this moment of joy. "This child," he whispered more to himself than anyone. "She wasn't born from desperation. She was born from choice, from love, from two broken people deciding to be whole together." Naya smiled, her eyes already closing with exhaustion. "That's our legacy," she murmured. "Not just surviving, but choosing to live, choosing to love, choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." As his wife and daughter slept, Thorne stayed awake a little longer, watching over them in the growing dark. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: raising a child, managing a ranch, navigating a life more complicated than he'd ever imagined. But tonight, in this moment, there was only peace. And that was more than enough. Thorne stood on the porch, watching a small girl with black hair chase chickens across the yard. Mariah Dakota Brennick, age 5, laughed as the birds scattered before her, her braids flying behind her like ribbons. "Mama says dinner soon," she called, breathless and flushed. "Tell your mama I'm coming." Naya appeared in the doorway, one hand resting on her swollen belly, their second child due in 2 months. She smiled at him, the same fierce smile that had first captivated him in a desert field years ago, though softened now by time and happiness. "Your daughter wore me out today," she said. "Our daughter, and you love it." "I do." From the north, dust rose, riders approaching. Thorne's hand instinctively went to his hip, where he no longer wore a gun, but Naya touched his arm. "It's just my sisters. They're early this month." 4 women rode into the yard. Takara, Tayan, Imalayuma, all grown now. Takara married with a child of her own. Tyan teaching at the tribal school, Imala training horses, Yuma engaged to a young warrior from a neighboring tribe. They came every month without fail, bringing news and laughter and the easy comfort of family. Mariah shrieked with joy and ran to her aunts, who scooped her up and spun her around. That night, after the sisters had settled in, after Mariah was asleep, clutching the new doll Yuma had carved for her, Thorne and Naya sat on the porch under familiar stars. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "The posts, the desert, every day. It's how I found you. It's how we found each other." She took his hand, placed it on her belly where new life stirred. "This one," she whispered, "will never know desperation. Only choice, only love." Thorne kissed her forehead, held his family close, and thanked whatever gods had led him to that hanging field 5 years ago. The field where 5 women had hung between life and death, where desperation had spoken its terrible offer, where a choice had been made, not the choice Naya had proposed, but the choice Thorne had made to give without taking to save, without owning to return what had been stolen, the right to choose. Some rescues he'd learned saved both people. From inside, he heard Mariah's voice talking in her sleep, probably dreaming of horses or chickens or the stories her aunts had told her about warriors and coyotes and stars that listened. "She's so much like you," Naya said, following his gaze. "Fierce, stubborn, kind. She's like us both, the best parts. And this one," Naya patted her belly, "will be loved, will be free, will choose their own path. As it should be." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed a lone man guarding 5 broken birds 5 years ago. The same stars that had watched those birds remember how to fly. Tomorrow, Thorne would help Takara repair her wagon. Naya would teach Mariah more Apache words. Tyen would tell stories. Imala would work with the horses. Yuma would talk about her upcoming wedding. Tomorrow would be ordinary and precious. But tonight, Thorne Brennick, 55 years old husband, father protector, and saved, simply held his wife's hand and watched the sky. "No regrets?" Naya asked softly. He thought about Mariah, his first wife, buried in the plot beyond the barn. He thought about 5 years of grief. He thought about a moment of choice in a desert field that had changed everything. "None," he said. "Not a single one." And he meant it. Because love, real love, wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about choosing every day to build something together, to honor what came before while embracing what came next, to plant seeds not from desperation, but from hope. Their daughter slept inside. Their second child grew in Naya's womb. The ranch thrived. The family gathered. And in the darkness of the Arizona desert, under an ocean of stars, 2 people who had found each other at the edge of death sat together at the center of life, choosing each other, still, always.